Now let's take this one step further and add some effects that come in after the transition has happened to give it all a little bit more of a unique style. We've only looked at a couple of effects so far and applied them to specific layers, but there's another type of layer in After Effects that we can use to apply effects to anything below it, and that's called an adjustment layer. If we come up to the layer menu, down to new, and then over to adjustment layer, I'll just click on that, and we have an empty layer, kind of like a null object. It looks kind of like a solid. It's named adjustment layer 1 down here, but it's sized to the comp and it actually will do something that affects how everything renders. What I can do is apply effects to it, and those effects will then be applied to everything below it in the layer stack. So I'm just gonna search for an effect called Gaussian blur. This is just a very basic blur effect. Double click on it, it's applied to the layer I had selected, and then just increase the blurriness to show you that this is blurring out everything in my comp, even the footage at the front end of my comp. And this is just a solid layer. If I click and drag it around, you'll see that it's only going to affect wherever it's overlaying in the comp. It's actually a solid layer, and if I go into my solids folder, there it is, adjustment layer 1. But if I toggle my switches and modes, we'll actually see that this little icon right here is checked. This is the adjustment layer switch. So this is absolutely no different than if I were to create a solid and enable that switch, because if I turn that off, then the solid is going to come back and nothing is going to be transferred from the effect controls down through my layer stack. So I'll just turn that back on, and now that we know what an adjustment layer is and how it works, how are we going to use it? Well, let me delete that Gaussian blur. I don't actually want to blur out my footage. Instead, what I'd like to happen is somewhere around here, have a few effects start to fade in so that by the time that we get to the full screen graphic, we've applied a combination of effects to give us a specific look. So I'm gonna bring my adjustment layer's start point all the way to this point in time. An easy way to do this is just have your layer selected and press the left square bracket. That aligns the in point of the layer to the playhead, or the right square bracket aligns the end of the layer to the playhead. All right, so left square bracket to align it there. And the first effect I wanna apply is called noise. So I'm just gonna type out noise, and right here, I'm just gonna double click on the noise effect. So if I zoom in here nice and close, you probably guessed increasing the amount of noise value is going to increase the noise in my comp. Now, I don't want this to be overly exaggerated. I just want a little tiny bit of grain to make it feel a little more textured. So that's about as grainy as I want it to get. I'll set a keyframe for the amount of noise, press U to bring up the keyframe, and then shift that forward in time a few frames and change this back down to 0. That way it'll animate from 0 to what I set. So we don't have any noise before and then it fades in. Now, even that's really hard to see. I'm gonna zoom into 100%, so I'm looking at this at full quality, full resolution, and it is pretty subtle, but I don't wanna overdo it. Maybe I could increase it 1 or 2 more percent, but I really don't wanna push that too far. The next effect I wanna apply is the glow effect. So I'm gonna search for glow, double click on that, and this is really gonna bloom out all of the bright colors, but I don't like the default look, so let's change some of these properties. Now there are lots of properties in this effect. You don't need to worry about all of them really. I'm just concerned with the threshold, the radius, and the intensity. First of all, the threshold is what determines how much of this image is being affected by this glowy bloom. So the lower this value, the more of my image will be blown out. So let's dial that back a little bit closer to where it was already. And then the next option, glow radius, is how far out this blooms. Now, you can make this really tight or you could push it out really far. I'm leaning more towards really blowing it out, so all these colors kind of just blend into each other and bloom into each other. Then we have glow intensity, and by default, this is making a big difference. If I turn this on and off, it's almost creating gradients where there weren't before. I think that's too intense, so I'm just gonna dial that back until we get to around maybe 0.4 or 5. And now this is a much more subtle glow. The other thing I want to take into account is that the layers stacking order changes how things render. So first we're applying the noise and then we're applying the glow. I would like the noise to happen after everything else, so I'm going to click and drag that down, and that actually made a difference. See, when I rearrange these, it's very subtle, but it is making a difference. So if I turn the visibility of my adjustment layer off and back on, we can see what that's doing. maybe the intensity could be bumped up just a little bit more. But now we've got that nice soft glow as well as the graininess. Now I need to keyframe that glow value on, otherwise it's just going to pop on right there on that frame. So I'm gonna go again to the same spot for the second keyframe of the noise and set a keyframe on the glow intensity. Once again, I'll press U to bring up that keyframe, go back to the start of that layer, and then change that all the way down to 0 so that it animates that glow on. And then we're gonna need to reverse those keyframes to get it to come off. And there's a really quick way to do this. Since these keyframes are all on one layer, I can copy them with Control C, paste them with Control V, and then just right click on one of the keyframes, go down to Keyframe Assistant, and time reverse keyframes. And that's just gonna reverse their orders so that instead of animating in, it's now going to animate out. So by the time this transition is completed, the glow and the noise has disappeared. I'm just gonna easy ease all these keyframes with the F9 key on the keyboard just for good measure, and let's play this back as a whole. And I'll even maximize this with the tilde key. All right, I like the way that looks a lot. It's two very simple effects, but combined on top of everything we've already created, really brings it all together. If I turn it on and off, you can see just what a difference that's making. And just to keep my project organized, I'm gonna rename this adjustment layer Effects, and I think this graphic's finished. So we took what we created with that lower third graphic and we translated it into a full screen title graphic using some very basic design principles to carry through this visual language and make it feel like it's part of the same package. And leveraging the effects that we have access to can really add a lot of depth and give it a final polish that really finishes off the design and brings it all together. Don't forget to download the assignment PDF and try all of this for yourself. Sometimes motion graphics have a lot of information that they have to communicate all at once, and it can be a little bit difficult figuring out the best way to present that so that the viewer can actually take it all in. It's really important that it's all easy to read, but there are other considerations that you need to make as well. And it's also really smart to make your compositions easy to customize and edit so that if you need to change anything, it's not that big of a deal. So that's exactly what we're going to take a look at in this lesson. This next graphic is going to be a standings chart, or like a progress chart for all the competitors in this fictitious broadcast event that I'm making up as we go. But let's say that the broadcast cuts to a clip of the ocean waves and we want to see stats with a list of the contestants, maybe their standings and how far they are in their progress throughout this entire event. Well, this is a type of graphic that could be pretty complex, have lots of layers and information, and likely need to be updated and spit out multiple versions of it depending on what part of the show it's being put on. Which is why it's always a good idea to think how you can work intelligently in After Effects. Setting yourself up for flexibility and being able to make changes on the fly without having to dig through a ton of layers. And that's exactly what we're going to do here. In terms of design, what we need is something that acts as a background to separate the text from this background footage. So why don't we just start by making a rectangle? I'll double click on the rectangle tool, make sure that it has a solid fill and it doesn't have a colored stroke. So we'll just take the stroke completely off. And to make the text nice and legible, I'm probably gonna wanna go with a darker color. So I'll just change the fill color here, and I'm thinking something on the complementary side of the orangish red that we've been using. So opposite side of the color wheel would be somewhere in the blues. And like I said, I wanna make this darker. So maybe something like a deep navy, just so that the text stands out on top of it really clearly. I'll click OK, and I don't want this to fill up the entire screen, so I'll want to take the size down, and I'll just scale this down a bit until it fits a little bit more comfortably in the center of the screen. And it'd be a good idea if I brought up my title and action safe guides, just so I got an idea of how close to those borders we are. So this right here, this is the title safe guide. I don't want any text to go beyond that. So I think I'll probably scale this down even a little bit further, just so all of the important information is contained within the center of the screen. I do still want to implement a little bit of a skew to just tie in all these graphics together, so maybe we'll increase that up to maybe 6 degrees. And I also think that the box is just taller than it needs to be. This is based on the 16:9 aspect ratio, but I don't have to stick to that. So I'll just uncheck that link between the width and the height and shrink this down just a little bit. I think that frames out the background pretty well. And to make it even less distracting, what I'm going to do is add an adjustment layer. So I'll go up to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, drag that just above the footage so it's not going to affect this box or any of the text on top of it. And I'll rename this layer BG Adjust, and this will be all the adjustments I make to just the background. And then just search for Gaussian Blur and apply that to the adjustment layer. Now I should point out that if you're going to be compositing this inside of an editor like Premiere over top of other clips, adjustment layers are not going to transfer when you render this out, or even if you're transferring the After Effects project file into Premiere. The footage that these adjustment layers affect has to be in the same comp. But you could recreate what I'm about to do here inside of Premiere very easily. All I want to do is go forward maybe 2 seconds in this timeline, set a keyframe on the blurriness, go forward maybe 1 more second, so the 3-second mark, and really blur this out so that the focus leaves the background and goes to this graphic that will be on the foreground. Another thing I'd like to do is tint the background so it's not so saturated and distracting. So I'm going to search for the tint effect, which will let me do just that. I'll double click that onto the adjustment layer, and this is going to desaturate it by default. It's not quite what I wanted. Instead, I'd like to make it a similar color to this rectangle right here. So I'll just grab that color with my map black 2 value, and this will tint all of the shadows to be that color. And then I'll grab my map white 2 and I'll make that the same color. And this is just going to fill it with that color, but it gives me a starting point to adjust from. So if I click on that swatch now, I can edit this color and make it brighter so it's not quite as extreme. And maybe I want to make this a little bit more in the teal range. Same thing for the shadows. I'll just go into there, make this a little bit more of that tealish coastal color, click OK, and I can make this less intense just by dialing back the amount to tint value. So maybe I only want to tint it about 25%, somewhere in there. Both of these effects can be added to clips even using adjustment layers in Premiere. It's all the same concept, so you can recreate this in Premiere if you need to be able to work very quickly directly in a timeline and not bounce back to After Effects. But let's set a keyframe on that amount to tint value and press U to bring up the keyframes. Go back to the first keyframe in the blur value and turn the amount to tint all the way down to 0. Then I'll trim this layer to that point in time by pressing Alt-Option and the left square bracket. Easy ease these keyframes with F9 on the keyboard and then play it back. So now it's going to gradually blur and tint to put the focus on this foreground rectangle. So I'm just going to collapse that layer and lock both it and the footage so I don't accidentally move them around. But that's going to be my starting point for all of the animation of this chart. So that's where I want to kind of align this layer. And I think for this particular graphic, what I'd like to do is have the box just pop up and fade in. Don't need to animate the size or the scale or anything like that. We just want it to kind of lift up and appear. So let's just start by renaming this layer Standings Container and then set some position and opacity keyframes. So we'll set one on the position here, on the opacity, and then shift those forward in time a little bit. And then just click and drag while holding Shift to drop this down a little bit and turn the opacity value all the way down to 0. So that will animate up into position. I just want to easy ease the position and opacity second keyframes. Then I'll just zoom in here, go into my graph editor and increase the influence for both of those handles and play that back to see how it looks. So there we go. Just as the background is fading out and getting tinted, this foreground standings box gets brought in. So what I'm picturing being contained within this box is a list of the contestants, and I can just use placeholder text for now. Probably a title up here in the left corner that says standings, and then next to each contestant's name, a progress bar, basically, almost like a loading bar on a computer with a bunch of checkpoint markers at the top, kind of showing the progress through the event. Again, this is all just made up and arbitrary, but this could apply to any number of graphics. Why don't we start with just adding that text standings up at the top? So I'll switch to my type tool, click, and type out the word standings. And then Control or Command Enter. I'm going to continue using that same font, just reposition this a little bit and maybe size it down. I don't want anything to be too big in the frame, but I'm picturing this having its own text box that is that same orangish yellow color that we've been using before. Again, just tying it into the previous design, but that'll probably go in the top left corner here. So let's make a text box for this specific text. I'll just switch to my rectangle tool, make sure to deselect all my layers, and then click and drag a box around that text. Let go there, take off the stroke, and add a linear gradient fill. I'll just edit that gradient by clicking on the gradient swatch And this is using that bright spot that we used on the background of the full screen title. I'm gonna get rid of that color stop and just drag this one all the way back and click OK. Then I'll just modify these handles so that we have a gradient that travels across the entire thing. And it does look a little bit dark to me, so maybe we wanna modify those colors. I'll go back into there and adjust this to be brighter, maybe even a little bit more yellow. I don't want to lose too much saturation, but something more like that. And then on this burnt red color, let's push that more into the orange, make it a little bit brighter, and click OK. I think that looks pretty nice, and maybe I'll just push the gradient over to the right side a little more, so it's a little more solid. All right, I'm going to turn off my title and action saved guides, and then add that same 6-degree skew to this rectangle so that it matches the standings box behind it. Let's rename this text box and drag it just below the standings text. Now that is a little difficult to read. I'm just going to reposition this a little bit and actually hold down the control key while dragging to snap it right to the center of the text. But I can make this easier to read by adding a drop shadow to the text. So let's zoom in here nice and close and search for the drop shadow effect. I'll drag that out onto my text, and I want the color to be similar to this orangish color over here. So I'm just going to sample that, maybe increase the saturation and darken it a little bit, maybe even make it a little more red. Click OK, and then change the softness so that it's not so chiseled. I might even pull back the distance a little bit so that we get more of that shadow around the top edge as well as the bottom edge, and even increase that opacity so that it really pops off of the background. So it's just a balance between the distance, the softness, and all the other properties to get something that helps make this text more legible. So now zooming out a little bit, that's much easier to read, and it adds a good amount of depth to the entire thing. What I'm going to do now is parent the text to that text box so I can reposition that text box and have the text go with it. So I kind of want to overlap that background box, maybe right about here, so that we're getting this layered, more depthy looking design. Another thing you can do with rectangles, which we looked at early on in this class, is add some roundness. So these are very sharp corners. Maybe we want to add some roundness this time. So let me select that box and click and drag on the roundness value in the properties panel. Obviously, I can make this really large and round them off a whole bunch, or I could make this more of a subtle thing and maybe do it around a value of 10. Now, if I click off of that, you'll be able to see those rounded corners. They're subtle, but they give a nice feel. Let's apply that same roundness to this box. I'll just select it, change that value to 10, and there we go. Now at the beginning of the animation, that box rises up and fades in. Why don't we go ahead and parent this text box to that standings container so that it moves with the box, but I don't want to animate it in the same way. I'd like to make it a little bit more interesting. Why don't we have it shooting off from the left side, basically scaling out and having that text move out with it. I'm going to need to animate two different properties for this, the actual size as well as the position of the rectangle. So let's go to where we want this to start animating on, maybe right about here, and I'll align both of those layers in points to the playhead with the left square bracket. Then with the text box selected, I'll set a keyframe on the size as well as on the position of that shape transform and move both of those keyframes forward in time. Then what I want to do is unlink the size, width, and height and change the width all the way down to 0. Now this again is going to size it from the center of the layer, so what I need to do is counteract that by moving the position over to the left. That way it's going to size up from the left edge. Now I just happened to pretty much nail where it needs to come out from, but if I were to move it a little bit too far to the left, you see that we're going to get some position motion with that. So really you just got to use some back and forth, adjusting this a little bit, seeing if it's moving, and play with it until it's locked in place. So I'm going to just adjust this a couple more times. It looks like it needs to move just over to the right a little bit more so that the scaling matches the position and it looks like it's just coming out from the left edge. So there we go. Let's easy ease all of those keyframes and jump into the graph editor, easing out the influence on all of these handles. So we'll pull this second one out a bit, pull the front ones in a bit, play that back, and now we've got a nice snappy animation. Now the text obviously is appearing before it should. What I'd like to do here is have the text box mat the text. So I'm just going to grab my toggle switches and modes button so I can see my track matte column, use the pick whip for the track matte to grab that text box layer, and re-enable the visibility of the text box so it doesn't disappear. Now that's going to reveal the text, And why don't we add a little bit of secondary motion to that text layer as well, just like we did with the full screen title dropping out at the same direction as the background. So I'll set a position keyframe here, aligned with the second keyframes of the text box, move back a little bit, and then click and drag this while holding Shift to the left. Might even go a little bit further. That way the text is moving in the same direction as the box. I just need to easy ease these keyframes and apply similar easing here as we did to the other keyframes. Now that text is going to shoot out in the same direction as that box and give us a little bit more layered motion. Okay, so we've got a good start here, revealing the background container as well as the text in the text box. I am noticing that I like this tealish color that we've got going on in the water though, so maybe I'm gonna just change the color of that background box a little bit, make it a little more in that teal color. All right, that feels good. I'll click OK. And this will be a great foundation for holding all the other information.